May 16, 1944, the Kansas Plains. It began with a low rattling sound that traveled across the wheat fields before anything could be seen. Private First Class Hiroto Matsumura, formerly of the 55th Infantry Regiment, sat on the edge of a flatbed truck, his shackled boots tapping rhythmically against the metal. He mistook the noise for wind against the wheat, a strange kind of rustling, almost peaceful. Then came the smell. Damp iron, engine grease, and something else, something alien. It reminded him of wet leather and dust baked in the sun. The smell of livestock, grain, diesel, and civilization too wide to understand. The column of trucks rolled up to the fence line. The guards shouted in English sharp, clipped words Hiroto couldn't decipher, and a gate slid open on creaking hinges. A faded sign read, Camp Concordia, U.S. Army POW branch. The truck stopped, the doors opened, and the prisoners stepped down into America. Hiroto had been captured 6 weeks earlier on New Guinea after a week of starvation, surrounded by American infantry and forced to surrender with a broken rifle and a bullet in his thigh. He expected barbed wire, screaming guards, and long days of humiliation. Instead, he was handed a canteen, saluted by a tall white soldier, and escorted to a barracks where the beds had clean sheets and the bread was still warm. No one shouted. No one beat them. A corporal handed Hiroto a paper slip written in Japanese and English. He couldn't read much of the English yet, but one phrase stood out. You will be assigned work. You will be paid. He blinked. Paid. Was it a mistranslation? But the next morning, just before dawn, a man arrived in a dusty pickup truck wearing blue denim overalls and a Stetson hat. He spoke with a heavy drawl through a translator. He was a farmer. His name was Thomas Ray. And he was there to hire them. Hiroto and 9 other prisoners were marched into the truck bed. No rifles, no barbed wire inside, just the open road. The Americans called it voluntary labor. What it felt like, to a man who had expected to be treated like an animal, was something closer to disbelief. They drove for an hour past vast yellow fields and lonely windmills, through open roads that seemed to stretch into eternity. When the truck stopped, the prisoners were given gloves, cotton shirts, and wide-brimmed hats. Then, to Hiroto's astonishment, they were handed steel tools. Unshackled, unsurveilled, working beside American farmhands. There were no guards shouting over them, no rifle barrels pressed to their backs, just rows and rows of wheat, and an American farmer who expected them to do their share, and who shook Hiroto's hand at midday when they finished their first rows. You work fast, Thomas said, offering him a jar of something cold. That's good, the harvest doesn't wait. The translator leaned in. He says you work fast, that's good. Hiroto stared at the jar. It was Coca-Cola, sweet, carbonated. The first taste exploded on his tongue like something chemical, something futuristic. He almost gagged, but then he drank the rest in 3 seconds. That night back in the camp, he and the others were handed small envelopes. Inside were paper notes. U.S. government-issued script, valid only at the canteen. The men whispered in disbelief. They'd been paid. Even more than the cold drink, more than the food, it was the idea that stunned them, that their enemy, the Americans, not only spared them, not only fed them, but treated them as laborers, with wages. It felt like a trick, a slow humiliation. But the next day, they were driven out again, and again the day after that. After a week, Hiroto stopped waiting for the cruelty to begin. It didn't come. What came instead were sandwiches packed in wax paper by American wives, cigarettes, cold water from the back of the truck, and more script folded neatly, always on time. The others began to talk, quietly at first, then louder. This isn't war, one whispered. This is madness. It's a lie, said another. They will turn on us when we let our guard down. But the days kept passing, the sun kept rising, and the American farmers kept smiling. It was too much for Corporal Takashi Ishida, the senior man in their work crew. On the 10th day, after shaking hands with Thomas and thanking him for lunch, Ishida stormed into the barracks and punched the wall hard enough to break his knuckles. "Do you not see what this is?" he roared. "They want to gut us, turn us into livestock, dogs grateful for scraps." But no one answered. Because deep down they weren't angry. They were confused, ashamed, and beneath it all they were grateful. The war that had taught them to kill had never prepared them for mercy. 2 weeks later, Hiroto used his first script note to buy a postage stamp from the camp canteen. He wrote home to Hiroshima. The letter would be censored, of course, but that didn't matter. He wrote, "I am working on a farm. We are being paid. I do not understand this country." Neither did the Americans, really. Some farmers still looked at the Japanese POWs with suspicion, especially the older men who had lost sons at Pearl Harbor or Guadalcanal. But even they couldn't argue with the results. These were hard-working prisoners, quiet, respectful, efficient. Thomas Ray stood on his porch one evening, watching Hiroto shovel grain into a silo with steady, clean movements. "Strangest damn war I've ever seen," he muttered. "We shoot at M one year, then hire M the next." The translator only laughed. "He says you work hard." Hiroto didn't answer. He just kept shoveling. But later that night, sitting on his cot in the still heat of the Kansas summer, he stared at the ceiling and whispered to no one, "So do you." By the 3rd week, the men were sending requests through the translator. Could they learn English? Could they help repair fences? Could they volunteer for extra days? Some even asked if they could stay in America after the war. It was against every idea they'd been raised with. The American was supposed to be crude, soft, decadent. But these people, these farmers, were something else. They were disciplined, industrious, kind in a way that felt dangerous, not the kindness of weakness, the kindness of power. One afternoon, as they drove back to the camp with sacks of wheat and coins of sweat staining their undershirts, Takashi turned to Hiroto. "They are winning," he said. "We already lost," Hiroto replied. Takashi shook his head. "Not just the war, everything." And Hiroto understood. The battlefields were thousands of miles away, but the empire was dying here in wheat fields, under open skies, with wages folded into brown envelopes. They would never see their homeland the same way again. They didn't know it yet, but their letters home were already confusing the censors in Tokyo. The war had taught them how to kill, but this country, their enemy, was teaching them how to live. And that, more than any bomb or bullet, was what Japan was not prepared for. By the end of June 1944, the sun over Camp Concordia had turned harsh and merciless. The wheat harvest was in full swing, the air dry and sharp with dust, and the days blurred together in a rhythm none of the prisoners had expected to understand, let alone participate in. The sirens of war were now distant echoes, no bombs overhead, no rifle cracks, no screaming officers demanding death for the emperor. Here, in the heart of America, time moved differently. It did not march with drums. It drifted with the wind across cornfields and barbed wire. Hiroto Matsumura had begun to wake without the need for the morning bell. His body had adjusted to the demands of the field, shoulders calloused, forearms strong, skin darkened. He carried buckets of feed, dug irrigation channels, repaired fence posts. Work that had once humiliated him now settled into something resembling peace. Not pride, but not shame either. His English was improving, not fluency but function, enough to understand when Thomas Ray said, "Careful near that wire, snake country," enough to laugh when the translator struggled to explain the word hayloft. In the evenings, Hiroto began writing letters that said less about the war and more about the work. He described the weather, the smell of the grain silos, the way the farmers moved through their days with a kind of quiet mastery. His words were measured, neutral, but the censors in Tokyo didn't like them. "Too American in tone," one censor scribbled. "This man is forgetting who he is," another said. But how could Hiroto forget? Every day he remembered who he was, because every day chipped a little more from the man he had been. One July afternoon, as the trucks rattled toward a new field, a younger prisoner named Kazuo leaned over and whispered, "I used to think these people were monsters. Now I think, maybe they're just tired of killing." Hiroto didn't answer. He was watching something else. The way Thomas Ray's young son, maybe 10 years old, ran alongside the truck barefoot, waving. The boy had a wooden rifle slung over his shoulder and a toothy grin stretched across his face. He yelled, "Hiya, hiya." The prisoners didn't know how to respond. Some waved, some looked away. Hiroto nodded once. The boy beamed. It was a strange thing, to be cheered by the child of the enemy. And stranger still to feel seen. At the next farm they were joined by German POWs. Stiffer, more guarded, they kept to themselves, spoke only among their own, and eyed the Japanese with a mix of confusion and contempt. One German, tall and blond, said in halting English, "You take this treatment too easily. We are soldiers, not labor." Takashi Ishida answered without looking up, "You are prisoners, same as us. We are paid, we eat, we work." "But we should resist," the German insisted. "We should not accept this." Takashi dropped his shovel. "Then refuse," he said. "Starve if you wish. We will not die for pride." That night the Japanese and Germans slept in adjacent barracks, but the silence between them was louder than any argument. By late summer, Hiroto had memorized the rhythm of the farm. Wake, load, work, rest, load, return. And between it all, the tiny, ordinary moments that rattled the walls of everything he had been taught. One morning, as he repaired a gate with Thomas, the farmer lit a cigarette and offered him one without a word. Hiroto hesitated, then took it. They smoked in silence. Two men, enemies by definition, yet standing shoulder to shoulder under the rising sun, the wheat swaying like waves around them. Thomas pointed to the horizon. "Storm coming," he said. Hiroto looked, dark clouds gathering. "Yes," he replied, "always a storm." Thomas nodded, not understanding, or maybe he did. In the mess hall the guards grew laxer. The language barrier shrank. Some soldiers even played cards with the prisoners, war stories replaced with stories of home. Baseball, sweethearts, motorbikes. One guard, Private Evans, gave Hiroto a small pocket Bible and said, "For luck." Hiroto didn't know what to do with it, but he kept it. The guards didn't treat them like enemies anymore. They treated them like laborers, like men. That was, in some ways, worse. It made the war feel like a ghost that no longer mattered. It blurred the edges between sides. Some prisoners resisted it. They refused to speak English. They mocked those who smiled at farmers, but it was a thin resistance and it faded quickly. Because the food was good, the work was honest, the wages were real. Each man was issued camp currency, green and brown paper, stamped by the U.S. military, and allowed to buy soap, chocolate, postcards, even cigarettes. Some saved. Others spent freely. A few started carving wood sculptures to sell back to the guards for extra scrip. The irony wasn't lost on them. "Imagine," said Kazuo one night, "Japanese soldiers earning American money carving American wood to sell to American guards inside an American camp." They laughed, a bitter laugh, but still a laugh. It wasn't just the work that changed them. It was the space, the silence between days, the absence of cruelty, the lack of humiliation. These things, so small, unmade years of ideology. And one afternoon, something even stranger happened. A farmer named Richard Dahlin, gray-bearded and stooped with age, asked the translator if Hiroto could help deliver a calf. Hiroto blinked. "He wants me to what?" "To help. His wife is sick. His son's away in Europe." They drove to the barn. The calf was breeched. Dahlin didn't speak a word of Japanese, but he pointed, gestured, showed Hiroto what to do. For 2 hours they worked, sleeves rolled, hands bloody, breath short, until the calf slipped free into the straw. It was alive. Dahlin laughed, clapped Hiroto on the back so hard he nearly fell over, then handed him a biscuit and a glass of milk. "Damned fine work," he said. Hiroto sat in the barn doorway, staring at the sky. A prisoner helping an enemy birth a new life. No bullets, no fire, just breath and straw and sunrise. That night he wrote in his journal, the one no censor would ever read. "I have stopped waiting for this to be a trick. I no longer believe they are hiding something. This is simply how they are. They make things grow." He didn't know whether to be comforted or terrified. Because if this was the enemy, what did that make everything they had believed? The summer heat eased by late August. In the mornings, the fields were cool and quiet, the fog hanging low like silk over the Kansas plains. The POWs rose with the same rhythm now as the American farmhands, not because they were forced, but because they preferred it. Hiroto Matsumura no longer thought in days or weeks. He thought in harvests, in chores, in progress measured not by territory seized but by the height of grain silos and the softness of tilled earth. Sometimes he forgot he was a prisoner. Sometimes, for a moment, he forgot there was a war at all. One morning, while stacking crates of tomatoes, he overheard Thomas Ray speaking to a local store owner through the translator. Thomas was laughing, shaking his head, wiping his brow. "Says he's losing money," the translator explained later, chuckling. "These boys work too hard. He feels guilty paying 'em so little." The other prisoners didn't laugh. They nodded. It wasn't sarcasm. It wasn't even bitterness. They had worked harder for less or for nothing at all back home. In Japan, loyalty was payment. In America, labor earned wages. And though the script wasn't real currency, the logic was clear. You did something useful, you were rewarded. It was simple, it was powerful, it was dangerous. Because it made sense. And that's what terrified the officers back in Tokyo the most. The letters hadn't stopped. Dozens of POWs at Camp Concordia were writing home, often using the same phrases, the same tone. "We are paid. They are not cruel. We are working and alive." For a government still pushing the lie that Americans tortured prisoners and executed the dishonorable, these letters were poison. In early September, the prisoners were called to assembly. Captain Robert Hanley, the American camp officer, stood beside a civilian in a gray suit and fedora. The translator relayed the message. A directive had come from Tokyo, passed through the International Red Cross. All POWs were reminded that labor was optional. That fraternization with enemy civilians was discouraged. That patriotism must be preserved. Hiroto heard the words but didn't move. Neither did anyone else. Even Takashi Ishida, who once raged against every handshake and every sandwich, said nothing. The war was still on. They hadn't forgotten, but the walls between enemy and human were no longer clean. That week something shifted. The POWs began to change the camp itself. Tables were repaired. A mural was painted on the side of the mess hall, a rising sun next to a field of wheat. A library corner was started in the rec hall. When guards came by to check, they often found prisoners helping each other learn English or writing poetry in tiny hand-bound notebooks made of scrap paper. Hiroto began translating signs for the American kitchen staff. Kitchen clean, lunch 1200. He'd never been praised for handwriting before. But when the cook, a round woman named Myra, gave him a Hershey bar and clapped his shoulder, he grinned like a child. It was not betrayal. It was gravity, something pulling him toward a new understanding of what it meant to be seen, to be acknowledged. One Sunday, a chaplain from Wichita was invited to deliver a short message of peace. The guards expected the prisoners to skip it. Instead, over 50 showed up, sitting cross-legged in the open field, not to convert but to listen. The chaplain read from Psalms. He spoke gently. Then, at the end, he said something no one translated but that Herodo understood well enough. Every man is made in God's image, and all men are worth more than what war makes of them. It wasn't a sermon, it was a seed. That night, Kazuo asked Herodo something strange. If Japan loses, would you stay? Herodo blinked. Stay here. Yes, work for the farmers, build something. It's not possible. But would you? He didn't answer. The very next day, news filtered into the camp, muffled, distorted but unmistakable. Saipan had fallen. And with it, a corridor to the Japanese homeland had opened. The American bombing campaign was getting closer. The prisoners knew what that meant. Their families, their cities, were no longer beyond reach. Men stopped writing letters. Some sat in silence for hours, eyes locked on the sky. Others wept privately, then scrubbed their faces raw in the showers, as if the tears themselves were a kind of betrayal. Takashi Ishida, once the fiercest among them, refused his scrip rations one morning and stood alone by the fence line. When Herodo approached, Takashi didn't look at him. If my family is dead, he said, I don't want to live on American bread. That night someone tore down the Witen-sun mural. The paint was found scratched and bleeding across the concrete, trampled in the dust. But by morning, a group of prisoners had already started repainting it. The silence didn't last. 3 days later, a new notice was posted inside the canteen. A handful of Japanese prisoners were being transferred volunteers to other camps across the Midwest where labor was needed. Sugar beets in Nebraska, fruit orchards in California, docks in Oregon. None of the prisoners were forced, but 40 signed up within the first hour. Herodo's name was on the list. He wasn't fleeing anything. He wasn't betraying anyone. He was chasing something he couldn't yet explain. Not freedom, not even survival. Just the chance to keep working, to move forward, to be somewhere where men shook your hand before handing you a shovel. When his name was called, Thomas Ray stood at the truck. He handed Herodo a small envelope. Inside was a photograph, faded, sepia-toned. It showed Herodo, covered in sweat, holding the newborn calf, grinning wide with Thomas laughing beside him. I thought you might want to remember the day you became a Kansas farmhand, Thomas said. The translator tried to explain. Herodo cut him off. I understand. Thomas held out his hand. You're a good man. Herodo hesitated, then he shook it. No one saluted. No flags waved. But that handshake felt heavier than anything he had carried through the jungles of New Guinea. When the truck drove away, the wind picked up, kicking dust through the wheat. And Herodo sat in the back, staring at the photograph, wondering if home was a place you were born into or something you could earn. The dust of Kansas faded into the rearview mirror. Herodo Matsumura sat in the back of a troop transport with 15 other Japanese prisoners as they crossed into Nebraska under a sky the color of brushed tin. No chains, no guards with bayonets, just a corporal in a soft campaign hat chewing sunflower seeds and an American driver who whistled Glenn Miller tunes with the window down. The road stretched endlessly ahead. To Herodo, it felt less like transportation and more like translation, something shifting inside him with every mile. Their new home was a camp outside Scottsbluff, smaller than Concordia with fewer fences and fewer rules. The land here was different too, sugar beet country, flat, dry, sprawling. The farms were family-run and spread thin. Labor was short. The war had pulled too many boys overseas, and now women and old men manned the fields, glad for any help, even if it wore the same uniform as the enemy. That first morning, the camp officer, Lieutenant Harris, gave them instructions through a translator. They were expected to work 6 days a week. Sundays were theirs. No guards would accompany them to the farms, only drivers. Their behavior would determine whether that policy continued. Hiroto nodded. He already knew the rules: show up, work hard, stay invisible. But what he didn't expect was the woman. Her name was Ruth Carpenter. She owned 300 acres outside Juring. Her husband had died the year before in the Pacific, his transport torpedoed on the way to Leyte. She was 37, with steel-gray hair pinned back under a wide straw hat, and she greeted them with nothing more than a nod and a clipboard. "You work, you get lunch. You do it right, you come back. That's all I care about." The translator relayed the words. Hiroto met her eyes and saw nothing there. No hatred, no warmth, just fatigue, and maybe curiosity. They harvested beets in silence for 2 weeks. At first, Ruth kept her distance. She drove the truck, handed out tools, poured water from a jug, and stood at the edge of the fields with her arms crossed, watching. But she noticed the way Hiroto stacked crates, precise, balanced, efficient. She noticed how he reorganized the tool shed without being asked. She noticed, without saying anything, that he never smoked, never asked for a break, and always helped the weaker men finish their rows. Then one afternoon, she handed him a folded newspaper. On the front page was a grainy photograph of Tokyo, bombed, smoking, flattened. Beneath it, the headline, B-29s rain fire on Japanese capital. Hiroto stared at it for a long time. His family lived in Honjo, just east of the Sumida River, or had. He folded the paper and handed it back. She didn't say a word, but she poured him an extra ladle of stew at lunch. That night he didn't sleep. The war had returned, not in bullets or uniforms, but in the shape of ash over paper. What had seemed distant was suddenly inside his ribcage again. The next day he worked harder. That week, Ruth did something she hadn't done since the war started. She asked one of the prisoners if they could fix the irrigation pump. Hiroto said he could try. She watched him strip the motor with quiet confidence, hands steady, eyes focused. He didn't ask questions. He didn't waste movements. An hour later, the pump coughed to life. She almost smiled. "You boys aren't what they told us," she said. The translator translated. Hiroto bowed slightly. "Neither are you." The tension cracked just a little. By mid-October, the harvest neared its end. The sun was low and copper-colored. The days grew shorter, and Hiroto found himself doing more than digging. He helped mend fences. He washed tools. He swept the barn without being told. One afternoon, Ruth let him ride up front in the truck. "Easier than bouncing around in the bed," she muttered. He said thank you. She glanced at him. "You speak more English than you let on." "Only when it matters," he replied. She almost smiled again. At camp that night, Kazuo leaned over his cot. "You like her." "She lost a husband, maybe a son," Hiroto said. "That doesn't answer the question." "I like that she doesn't pretend to hate me. That's enough." The next week, Ruth brought them something none of them expected. Pies. Apple cherry, rhubarb. Baked by her daughter. "They're a little burnt," she said, laying the tins out on the tailgate. "Don't complain." No one did. The sweetness was a kind of violence all its own. It reminded Hiroto of late autumn festivals in Tokyo, when street vendors lined the alleys with warm snacks and children chased each other through lantern-lit crowds. It reminded him of home, but more cruelly, it reminded him that home might no longer exist. That night he did not eat dinner. He walked laps around the edge of the compound, fists clenched, heart full of something unnameable. When he returned, Kazuo was sitting cross-legged on the bunk. "I heard something from the driver," Kazuo said. "A rumor about the bomb." Hiroto looked up. A new weapon. The Americans dropped it on a city, not firebombs. One bomb, thousands dead. Instant. Hiroto didn't react. "Where?" he asked after a long pause. Kazuo hesitated. "Hiroshima." The name hung in the air like a blade. Hiroto sat down slowly. "That's my city." No one spoke for a long time. He didn't cry, he didn't ask for more. He simply stared at the floor, his face hollow, his hands motionless. The next morning he asked not to be sent out. The camp commander allowed it. But the day after that he showed up again at the truck. Ruth said nothing. She handed him gloves. He nodded. They worked in silence until dusk. At the end of the day, as the sun vanished behind the silo, Ruth leaned on the fence beside him. "I'm sorry," she said. He didn't ask how she knew. He just looked at the wheat and said, "So am I." September rolled into October, and the wind on the Nebraska plains sharpened with every passing morning. The sugar beet rows grew brittle underfoot. Jackets reappeared. Gloves stayed on longer. And though the harvest was winding down, Hiroto Matsumura worked faster than ever. Not because he was ordered to. Because he didn't know what else to do. The rumors wouldn't stop. First came word of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, too massive, too instantaneous to be believed. Then Nagasaki. Then silence. Some prisoners clung to disbelief. Others wept in private. A few, like Takashi Ishida, paced for hours in the yard, murmuring to themselves as though trying to wake from a dream. The guards said nothing. The farmers said less. The war was changing shape, becoming a rumor, a ghost, something too large to speak of and too close to deny. In early August, a driver arrived with a yellow Western Union telegram and a rusted radio. The camp officer, Lieutenant Harris, stood on the porch of the main office, the translator beside him. Everyone knew something had happened. Harris spoke slowly. His voice cracked halfway through the statement. "The Emperor of Japan has accepted the terms of surrender." The translator repeated the words in Japanese, then again more slowly. No one moved. For Hiroto, the sound did not register as truth. It felt like a mistake, a mispronunciation, something that would be corrected with rifles in the morning. But it was. The war was over. The next hours passed like a dream. Some men cheered. A few fell to their knees. One soldier collapsed, sobbing into the grass, fists clenched, body heaving with the weight of 5 years of belief shattering in a single breath. Takashi stood like a statue, unmoving, staring straight ahead. He said nothing. That night the prisoners were given extra rations. Real meat, cigarettes, pie. The guards didn't shout or watch from towers. The fences remained, but they felt ceremonial, like lines drawn in sand. The camp had changed. Everything had. The following morning, Hiroto returned to the carpenter farm. Ruth met him at the gate. "You still want to work?" she asked. He nodded. She handed him a pair of gloves and pointed to the barn roof. "Got a gutter needs fixing." He climbed the ladder in silence. From the top of the barn he could see the entire valley, wheat gone golden, the windmill spinning lazy circles in the breeze, the far hills still dusted with morning fog. It looked like a painting, too still to be real. Below him, Ruth worked in the dirt, hoeing rows of squash. She never looked up, never asked questions. She just let him fix the roof. Later that afternoon, she poured them both cups of coffee and sat with him in the shade. "War's over," she said finally. He nodded. "You going home?" "I don't know where home is now." She looked at him carefully, as though trying to see something beneath his skin. Not the uniform, not the history, the man. "My husband," she said after a long pause, "was in the Navy, died somewhere in the Pacific. They said the ship went down fast." "I'm sorry," he replied. "I was angry when you first showed up," she said. "Didn't want you on my land, didn't want to feed you. Then you fixed the pump. Then you saved that calf." She took a long breath. "Now I don't know what I feel." Hiroto didn't answer. She leaned back in her chair, eyes closed against the light. I just want things to grow again. So do I, he said. That night Kazuo asked him, do you think we'll go back soon? Maybe. And then what? I don't know. What if there's nothing to go back to? Hiroto didn't respond. He remembered the photo Thomas Ray had given him himself, smiling elbow-deep in hay, holding a calf. He hadn't smiled like that before. Not in uniform, not on campaign, not ever. It terrified him, not because it was false, but because it was. He'd found a version of himself on foreign soil that hadn't existed back home. And now that soil was slipping away. In the weeks that followed, the war's end echoed across the camp in slow ripples. Mail from Japan resumed barely. One man learned his sister had survived, another that his parents had died in the fires. Hiroto received a thin, crumpled letter written by an uncle he barely knew. It said only, "City gone, no word of your mother, come back if you can." He folded the letter into his shirt pocket, didn't tell anyone. The Americans began demobilizing the camp. The Red Cross visited, more radios arrived. The POWs were given updated uniforms, softer, less military. Some guards left. New faces came in. The lines blurred further. One morning, Ruth Carpenter approached the main office with a sealed envelope. She asked to speak with Lieutenant Harris. When he emerged, she handed it over. "It's for him," she said, "the one who fixed the roof." It was a letter of recommendation. For Hiroto Matsumura. "He's the best worker I've ever had," she said. "I'd vouch for him anywhere. If he can stay, if there's a way, he deserves the chance." Harris nodded, but he already knew the answer. There was no path for Hiroto to stay. The war was over. Repatriation was law. Still, the letter was added to his file. 2 weeks later, the orders came. The Japanese prisoners were to be returned in phases, first to processing camps, then to ships, then across the Pacific. Most would arrive in a homeland they no longer recognized. Hiroto packed his things into a small canvas bag, the photograph, the pocket Bible from Private Evans, the letter from his uncle, the gloves Ruth gave him, a single U.S. coin. On the morning of departure, the truck idled in the camp yard. The prisoners loaded slowly. There was no resistance, only silence. As he stepped up into the truck bed, he saw Ruth standing by the fence. She didn't wave, didn't smile. She just said, "I hope you find something worth building." Hiroto nodded. "I already did." The truck pulled away. As the dust kicked up behind it, Hiroto turned in his seat. The farm faded in the distance, silo, barn, windmill. He realized he would never see it again. But he also knew something deeper. It had changed him more than any battlefield. In the jungles, he had learned how to die. In Nebraska, he had learned how to live.